Get started here. I want to welcome everybody for our January Zoom meeting, and we're also doing it through Facebook. And what I want to do to get started, if you stand, Chris, would you lead us in the pledge?
Yes. I pledge allegiance
to the
to the
flag
flag of the United States of America
and to
and
the
to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody, but we do have a sad note that Dick Simpson passed away last month, and several of us did go to his services, and it was really good because he was very well supported by the Civil War people, because they also, even the National Civil War Museum came in and honored him. And like I said, if you look in the one picture, sort of flag it here, is where he was portrayed. He always portrayed Frederick. What was it? Yeah, Frederick Holbrook, the Vermont governor for during the Civil War. So he's going to be deeply missed. He had a lot of information. He's just a super good guy. So we're going to miss Dick. Also, for the media, just remind everybody and to go mute, because we don't want to hear what everybody's saying. And also, if you want, you could also stop your video, because remember, what you see, everybody else sees. So don't be do not be the CNN reporter. So, but I'd like to, just one thing to let you know that we do have a Gmail now, an email account, and I put it down here. It's Hershey Civil War. It's Hershey CWRT. It should be at gmail.com. I'll make that correction. So you can send me an email, or you can send it to the Hershey account if you have any questions. And if anybody's here, if you would send me your email address if you did not get this note, because like I say, my Outlook got messed up and it deleted all my contacts. So I'm trying to pull all my contacts back again. And as a reminder, May 6th, we're doing the Battle of Chancellorsville with Chris Mikowski, which we've already had him a couple times. You know, he does a bang up job. It's again, it's going to be all day. The fee's $95, and you could either go to the Hershey website, you can go to the Harrisburg website, or use any email to get. I think we have about 15 people already signed up now. And what I like to do now, Chris, I'll leave it over to you. I have you to take over and share, and it's all yours.
Okay. So I will stop you sharing.
You need me to stop it?
No, it allowed me to do.
Okay, good.
Pick it out. So. All right.
It's all yours. I'm going to go mute.
Very good. Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. We'll talk about the Union XII Corps and the campaign history of that corps. So much like in the book, I talk about both the Union and the Confederate side, just following this corps around. I'll just point out really quickly, I'm a big Alfred Woad fan. That's a Woad drawing of the 3rd Wisconsin. It's part of the 12th Corps, at just above the cornfield at Antietam. So we'll kind of show what they're doing later. All right, so talking to Ricky before, what decided to do just the Maryland campaign half of the book. I kind of like to do one half or the other, so I can get into a bit more detail. I will touch on some of the prior stuff, but I'm going to go ahead and give you read a couple quotes if you bear with me. So this is from a veteran in 1892 from the 102nd New York. He wrote, "No official reports or histories give us credit at Antietam any more than they do anywhere else. I used to get mad, but now I smile somewhat, thinking that it won't make much difference some 100 years from now. Some few historical names will live. The rest of us will come under the general head and the army moved. And General Banks, with 1 million men, a la Xerxes' errand to Persia, marched up the hill, etc. So if anybody's read some Herodotus, that you'll find that kind of humorous. But it's kind of true. Not many folks pay too much attention to 12th Corps, but at Antietam they actually do a kind of a good job. It's mixed in some places, and I'm also gonna, like I said, get into a little bit of what happened prior to Antietam, and so that's kind of what makes it even more of an interesting story. I think is the several weeks before the Maryland campaign kicked off were really kind of miserable for this Corps. And I'll just touch on it a little bit tonight, but here's a quote from John Pope referencing that time period, and he was the Army commander during that period. He wrote, "After such service as they had rendered, and the broken condition in which their gallant and heroic fighting at Cedar Mountain had left them, they should for a time have been withdrawn from the presence of the enemy until they could be rested and their officers replaced. I should have done so at once, but that it was impossible at that time because of the exigency of the situation." All right, so here's an overview of the events that occur in the book. So the Corps was formed on June 26th, along with the rest of the Army of Virginia. And then Cedar Mountain's the 9th. There's a really interesting period that I don't touch tonight. That's August 20th through the 25th. And it's a sort of a standoff along the Rappahannock River. Eventually, Lee makes his way across that river, and that leads to the Battle of Second Manassas at the end of August. There's a retreat to Washington in much more order than First Bull Run, but it's no less miserable. And then they enter Maryland on the 4th and campaign toward Antietam on the 17th. Just for a little background. Here's another great picture. This is Edwin Forbes, and this is from Little Washington, Virginia. And this is a grand review that took place on 28 July. And so, like I said, the Army and the Corps was formed on June 26th. It was formed from the different units had been operating independently and not very successfully in the Shenandoah Valley against Stonewall Jackson in the spring. And so after a little bit of maneuvering, the Second Corps Army of Virginia, which is what this unit was back then, they collected together for the first time at Little Washington. And this review was a large drill maneuver, and it culminated in this they all formed hollow squares, and you can see here Banks' cavalry guard charged each of the squares, and one of the Massachusetts officers called it sham battles. But it's a really interesting episode in the book, and there's a lot of good information on it. So I was able to introduce a lot of the historical figures and return to that in the first chapter. All right. So as I said, there was some initial maneuvering after that. Jackson wanted to isolate one of Pope's 3 corps, and he did that at Cedar Mountain. The result was pretty disastrous, but I'm going to just touch on one little aspect of it here. The Union, First Division, and 1 brigade of the First Division did have a really successful start. And that all ended when A.P. Hill showed up. He had been strung out on the road. And this map here is showing what's occurring before that. So we're going to focus on this area north of the Orange Culpeper Road. And there's a wheat field up here and then a scrub field to the north of it. And I'll give you a couple of anecdotes really quickly. So Lieutenant William Warren, he's in the 28th New York here. As they start across the wheat field, and these 3 anecdotes are to give you some sense of what the fighting was like at Cedar Mountain. But as they start across the wheat field, he spots the colors of the Virginia Regiment on the other side of the wheat field. He raises his sword. He's kind of encouraging his men to go get it, basically. And a ball takes off the tip of his right index finger. And he wraps that in a handkerchief and moves on. And then a little while later, he takes another ball below the left elbow. And eventually 13 pieces of bone are removed from that wound. A little while later, he's shot in the head. And that causes him to lose a piece of his skull. He was then blind in one eye, and his face is covered in blood. And continues on. He takes another ball in his neck between his windpipe and his carotid artery. Unfortunately for him, it missed both. The ball lodged at the base of his skull, and he felt that it swelled up like a peach basket. And then after Hill's brigades start to show up, and this is Samuel Wiley Crawford's brigade begins to fall back, and they have to make this kind of gauntlet run across the wheat field. In that period, he takes another ball in the center of his left leg above his knee, and that puts him on the ground. And he's there stuck for 2 days behind Confederate lines, like all the other Union wounded. And those conditions are really bad. I mean, it's about 98 degrees on the day of the battle. It can kind of continued like that. And you can imagine those conditions, but won't get too much into that. But Warren's 28th New York gets into this fighting with the 21st Virginia, and they're facing south. And the first that they hear anything of the 28th New York coming is when they get a volley in their backs at 30 paces. And that degenerates into hand-to-hand fighting. So Private Roswell Lindsay of the 21st Virginia is, of course, in that regiment. He's bayoneted by a Yankee, or excuse me, he bayoneted a Yankee, and he immediately fell from multiple gunshot wounds. The first came from a federal captain who was in turn bayoneted by several of Lindsay's comrades. And you might ask yourself, well, how's all this bayoneting happening? But it had degenerated into hand-to-hand combat in the woods there. The sun was almost down too, and you had smoke-filled woods. People were throwing rocks, fence rails, clubbed rifles, all of that. The third thing I want to tell you about is for the man pictured here, Captain Moses O'Brien. He commanded one of the companies in 3rd Wisconsin, and the 3rd Wisconsin's way off to the north here, about 3/4 of a mile from the wheat field. And its brigade commander, George Henry Gordon, sent 6 companies of that regiment forward to basically reconnoiter. And to make a long story short, they ended up joining this advance. But before doing it, they sort of uncovered to the right. They went too far. And when they came out of the woods, they ended up in this scrub field. And I'll just say really quickly, the traditional interpretation is that they're here in this wheat field, but my research has caused me to find that they were actually in the scrub field here. And they face off against the Stonewall Brigade, these 6 companies. And in about 2 to 3 minutes, they lose 30% of the folks engaged there. So Captain O'Brien, he's shot in the leg, and 2.5 of the companies withdraw to this ravine back here. And down in that ravine, he puts a tourniquet around his leg, his blood filling up his boot. And in a little while, Gordon's brigade shows up, and they join their regiment, the rest of his regiment, and go back forward. And they end up here in the wheat field fighting. And during that time, O'Brien gets shot in the body, and he too is down in the field for a couple of days. So 2 days later, when his men find him again, he's still alive, and he's told his wound is mortal. His men carry him because they were concerned about him riding in an ambulance. So they carry him by stretcher roughly 7 miles back to Culpeper, and he dies on a hotel porch. So I'm not going to run through all these casualties. You can see they're quite high, especially for Crawford's brigades, the one I was describing there. A foremost casualty is actually the Corps commander, Nathaniel Banks, and he's hit by another rider's horse before he gets mounted, and that's at the end of the battle. And he's riding an ambulance most of the rest of the campaign, and command kind of sways back and forth between him and the 1st Division commander, Alpheus Williams. And when they get back to the forts and around Washington, Banks is left behind, actually in command of the defenses. So the casualties among the field and company grade officers in Crawford's brigade were really quite high. and it was an exception to survive Cedar Mountain unharmed. This shortage of company grade officers caused the brigade staff to return to the regiments, and that would hobble, the brigade, division, and corps coordination for the rest of the campaign. And a notable example of this is Captain Robert Gouldshaw. He was on George Henry Gordon's staff at Cedar Mountain. He was company commander at Antietam, and he would be in charge of the 54th Massachusetts at Battery Wagner in 63. So you probably have heard of him. So the strength of the corps would continue to degrade. It's already a small corps, had heavy casualties here and a really kind of rough handling by Jackson. And it would degrade further in the period from August 20th, when that standoff across the Rappahannock begins, until they return to the forts around DC on September 2nd, September 3rd. And that's due to constant marching, counter-marching. Really, there was logistical problems, and they weren't getting any food really during this entire period. So I'm skipping forward in time a little bit here, and not doing the maps from the Rappahannock period, but this is where on August 25th, Stonewall Jackson does his flank march that puts him behind Pope for Second Manassas. And this is actually my favorite map in the book. It's really really a lot going on here. And so what you see is the Army of Potomac's beginning to show up here as well. So now you have the units from three different armies kind of maneuvering on this map. And where the 12th Corps, future 12th Corps is they're here, and they kind of move this way and then up the railroad to Bristow Station. So like I mentioned, during this period, they go through kind of a lot, and it kind of wears everybody down. I'll give a couple more quotes here. This is from an Indiana soldier. He found in an abandoned knapsack 2 bites of the grossest, fattest pork I ever saw, and also a small handful of moist, dirty cracker crumbs. But it was the sweetest morsel I ever ate. And then a New Yorker wrote that the only water available during this period was no better than could be obtained from a stagnant swamp hole. A Pennsylvanian wrote that the tongues of the men in some instances swelled, and their parched lips cracked from thirst. They chewed bullets when their tobacco was gone to excite the salivary secretions. They were marched by day and night. Many of them were ill with dysentery and low fevers, and that caused a lot of folks who were in this campaign to not be at Antietam. So there's a lot of turnover, a lot of people dropping out, turnover in the leadership. And then finally from Pope again, Banks' Corps is very weak, not amounting to more than 5,000 men, and is much demoralized. Banks' Corps must be left somewhere in the rear to be set up again. And that's in a small way what he does here. So the future 12th Corps becomes more and more disengaged after the 25th of August from the rest of the events. They don't take part in Second Manassas, and they end up guarding some railroad cars that are trapped here at the bridges behind Kettle Run and then Broad Run, from when Jackson came through and destroyed the bridges. So you had these trains with millions of dollars of property trapped on the southern side, and they were basically babysitting these cars. And as the battle was going on, they could hear the battle occurring. Banks actually sent a telegram requesting, basically to Pope's staff, do you really need me to remain here? Is this important, or should I be joining in this battle? They wanted to engage. And Henry Halleck actually responded and said, well, unless you have positive orders, you have to go over there and get involved. And then Ruggles, Pope's chief of staff, responded and said, no, those are your orders, stay put, basically. So they didn't want them involved at all. So after Second Manassas occurs, it goes badly. And this is kind of what we're left with. So Pope's army retreats to Centerville, more or less under order. And that battle was fought on the 29th and 30th. And Pope sent orders to Banks, who's down here at Bristow Station, to destroy those railroad cars and then to head to Centerville via Brentsville. And so that's not a straight line. The presumed danger was high, right? And so the reason for this is they're kind of jogging out of the way a little bit, out of fear that the Confederate army would be swinging through this way. So now you have a corps that was small, Pope thought was incapable of participating in the battle with the rest of the army, and is now potentially cut off with a victorious Confederate foe in between them and Pope's army. So sort of a bad situation. So the orders for that went out on late on the 30th, and the rider got lost in the way. He didn't show up until the next morning. So about 7 o'clock on the 31st. He delivered those orders. And so now you had the intervening however many hours where more could have happened, right, for the Confederates to move into that position. And so they begin destroying the cars. Everybody kind of understands what that means if they're destroying millions of dollars of property. And they set off. And so the 2nd Massachusetts, which is probably the most, or I guess I should say, arguably the most professional regiment in the Corps, they take the lead and set a grueling pace. But there are no stragglers during this march because everybody understands the potential danger. And they actually have a couple of creeks that they have to cross, and there's been some heavy rain, and those are beginning to rise. So there's potential of being kind of trapped behind those creeks too. Horses drop and are unharnessed and kind of left to die from exhaustion. But they actually make it up here to Centerville and across Bull Run without any kind of serious incident. Lee's infantry is moving around the other flank, and ultimately that leads to Chantilly. But Rosser's cavalry does head down to Manassas Junction. They do pick up a few 2nd Division folks, but that's kind of all that really happens. And so they get in to Centerville and learn of the battle, and that's even more demoralizing. The whole army heads off the next day. And that night is when Chantilly happens. This corps standing in the road as that thunderstorm breaks during Chantilly, and they basically stay there through the battle. They're not engaged. And that night, no one's allowed to light fires. And it's kind of like a colder than average night, and everybody's pretty miserable. And when the sun comes up the next morning, they are very ready to make it back to the forts around Washington. And they do make it over there. There's a couple of interesting episodes, but I'll skip on that for tonight. The one thing that does happen here is that Banks, over the course of this period, this whole August period, he developed some good intelligence actually for the Army commander a few times, and he sets one of those in motion here, where a detachment from the 28th Pennsylvania, a handful of enlisted folks, 17 of them, head out. Actually, it's 11. Excuse me. They head out from Centerville, cross past the battlefield at Chantilly, actually between the lines, and then continue up this way. And their mission is to figure out where Lee's army's going. And they send people back basically every day. And make a long story short, they end up on the wrong side of Lee's army with 17 Confederate prisoners. And they, I think, are down to like 11 or 10 at that time. And they get across Confederate lines with all those prisoners, get them on rafts, cross the Potomac, and make it back. It's kind of a very interesting episode. But as you can see from these quotes here, everybody's pretty miserable when they get into the forts around DC, very broken down physically and mentally. And the last quote, though, I think really encapsulates the shift from the first part of the book and the second part of the book, and because the second part goes a little differently. So news of Lee's movement north, not from the 28th Pennsylvania, but from signalmen near Frederick, send the Federals north into Maryland on September 4th. And I'll talk really quickly now about the makeup of the Corps. Now, this is a little bit different than it was at Cedar Mountain, but I'll kind of step through these folks really quickly. So Alpheus Williams is the First Division commander. He's a steady, dependable officer. So he was a Yale grad, served in the Mexican War in a Michigan regiment, and practiced law in Michigan. Samuel Wiley Crawford, he was a surgeon pre-war, and took a kind of fortuitous billet at Fort Moultrie in 1860. And when that garrison went away over to Sumter, he joined it and volunteered as a battery commander during the bombardment and got some early notoriety. He then shifted to the infantry as a major, served with Rosecrans in Western Virginia in the fall of 61. And by March of 62, he was a brigadier general. George Henry Gordon's a 46 West Point grad, kind of a famous class. He served in the Mexican War under Bull Sumner and the Dragoons, wounded twice, brevetted twice, fought a pair of Mexican guerrillas at a bridge. And then he got out after some frontier duty and practiced law in Boston. He formed the 2nd Massachusetts, made it a very highly professional regiment, and his whole brigade had a reputation for discipline. And these 3 units here at the top are the ones that had been with him. An issue with this brigade or with this division is you have a lot of new regiments who are 3 weeks from home and don't really know what they're doing. Other, high casualties or other issues, staff shortages, and morale, and actually low confidence in their leaders, more to the center and left of the screen. All right, the 2nd Division. This, unlike the 1st Division, looks very different than it did in at Cedar Mountain, because none of these people are in the same position that they were. And so you have George Sears Green. He's 6 years older than Robert E. Lee. He did not serve in the Mexican War. He got out of the Army too early before that. And then he did a lot of civil engineering work in New York. He re-entered with the 60th New York in 1862. And the kind of intense looking fellow there is Lieutenant Colonel Hector Tyndale. He is only in this position because about 4 other people either got injured or dropped out through illness during the period from Cedar Mountain to now. And he was a merchant in Philadelphia before the war. He escorted John Brown's wife to Harper's Ferry, and then escorted her and the remains back to Philadelphia after he was hanged. So I'm going to just focus on these 2 for a moment. So these 2 guys weren't very well liked going into Antietam. A quote about Green is, he's a finicking old jackass, takes all day to do nothing, and puts guards on all the houses to prevent the soldiers from doing any harm to the property of scoundrelly cutthroats of secessionists. He's rigid and severe, and our troops have taken a great antipathy to him. And there's talk about how he kind of over controlled on the march and things like that. Hector Tyndale was considered tyrannical. He was brought up on charges for that, actually. At that July 28th Grand Review, he dressed down one of his companies in the 28th Pennsylvania. He told them that if they ever did whatever it was that they did again, he would have all the men chained together like slaves and marched around with their officers behind them without a sword. And he did this in plain hearing of everybody else. He also refused water to soldiers on the march. So he got corrected for that, though. And yeah, people didn't like him too much. Somebody actually suggested that he might get shot by his own people if once they get into a fight. Okay, so they enter the Maryland campaign here. I'm going to kind of breeze through this section quickly, but the Union Army is broken into 3 wings. And what you see on the right, the right wing is where actually not the right wing, the center wing, excuse me, is where the second and Second Corps Army of Potomac and Second Corps Army of Virginia, that soon becomes the 12th Corps Army of the Potomac. And they continue up there. They get these green regiments kind of on this march. And then they continue up towards Frederick. Lee's army breaks away to go reduce Harper's Ferry. And most folks are familiar with that. The 12th Corps, 27th Indiana folks in Gordon's brigade discover Lee's lost order, and that precipitates further movement over towards Catoctin Mountain and then South Mountain. And so on the 14th, the Sumner's Corps, the Second Corps, and the 12th Corps don't actually take part in the fighting. That's by the 9th and 1st Corps at Fox's and Turner's Gap, and then the 6th Corps at Crampton's Gap. Sumner's 2 Corps, the road's clogged, and they end up going over the Shookstown Road, which was really a primitive road up over the mountain. And then they come down the other side, the panorama of Catoctin Valley, and then the battle taking place on the opposite ridge opens up before them, and they hustle back down the mountain. And they're going basically cross country from there. And it's really kind of a taxing day of marching. You have veterans who never dropped out before dropping out on this march. And part of that's they're still kind of worn out from the prior campaign. And then, of course, the green regiments, hardly any of them make it to just below Turner's Gap is where they bivouac for the night. Kind of in the meantime, Alpheus Williams loses the Corps. He takes dinner at a farmhouse, and then one of his staff falls off his horse. He sees that he gets medical attention, and then he can't find the Corps again. And in fact, he's supposed to meet McClellan in Middletown for some kind of meeting, and he basically blows McClellan off too. And the next day, Joseph King Fenno Mansfield is now the Corps commander of the 12th Corps, but that was kind of already in work, and I think that's what he was meeting him to talk about. So they make it over by the 16th to Antietam Creek, and I'm just going to kind of provide this is a little bit of overview slide. So on the 16th, the 1st Corps under Hooker makes it across the road, across the creek. And what you're seeing here mostly is activity that's happening on the next morning. But just to give you some bearings, Antietam Creek's over here. Union's forces are to the east. This is how Hooker's disposed the next morning. The 12th Corps, they are bivouacking around the Cost House. They think they're done for the night. At 10 p.m., they get told to get up, move without kind of making any noise. And they sort of meander over to a bivouac between the Line and Hoffman Farms between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning on the 17th. And they're about a mile and change away from where Hooker is. So the next morning when Hooker's fighting starts, all the men get up. They went to sleep on their arms in column like they had marched, and they're basically ready to go again. And they take off by 6 o'clock and head down to just west of the Sam Poffenberger Woods. So in the meantime, I'll give you a little bit of background here on the Confederates. So you have J.R. Jones and Lawton are the ones who are fighting Doubleday and Ricketts in the morning. And the units, though, that are relevant to the 12th Corps are D.H. Hill and his division, the Sunken Road, John G. Walker down here by Snavely's Ford, and Lafayette McLaws is still on the march from Harper's Ferry. And so the next morning, the fighting is, let's see here. So, like I said, they show up here by the Sam Poffenberger Woods, and they're waiting, and they're standing in column. Wounded absconders are making their way to the rear. They're heckling the ladder. Mansfield rides forward to talk to Hooker, and Hooker's up kind of in this area. So Mansfield rides forward. Williams is having this meeting, or he has a meeting under a tree with a couple of his regimental commanders, and they pull from a flask that all the veterans know to not contain water, and veterans after war were talking about how the optics of that were not very good at all, because the veterans in Crawford's brigade were only a little short of mutiny due to the contempt that they felt for Crawford. Part of that is multiple sources allege that he didn't join that charge across the wheat field at Cedar Mountain, and they're pretty reliable sources. So, so they didn't have a lot of confidence in their high leadership in the First Division, but Mansfield, 2 days on the job, inspired the men a lot. Came back from talking with Hooker, everybody's cheering, and he's kind of firing everybody up. So Crawford's brigade deploys first, and it's sort of a stumbling deployment. I'll show you here what's happening on the field before that, though. So after Ricketts and Doubleday and Jackson's 2 divisions sort of play each other out, that's when John Bell Hood's counterattack occurs, and he ends up running into the Pennsylvania Reserve Division, these 2 brigades here, and that's what you see right now is Hood fighting them. And up here is the 12th Corps coming into place. So they split 3 regiments up. Mansfield moves to the east with the 10th Maine, personally kind of guiding their movements and sort of overcooking his grits with the regimental commander a little bit. The 125th Pennsylvania goes forward, and they stall and fall back, and they're under Crawford. And Williams takes the 124th Pennsylvania over here by the North Woods and deploys them. Now, Hooker's plan changed a few times, but what he settled on was that the new regiments in Crawford's brigade would deploy between the Hagerstown Pike here and the East Woods in this area, and they would replace the Pennsylvania Reserves. The veteran regiments would come towards the East Woods, which is where the 10th Maine's going right over here, and then Gordon's brigade would come with really good kind of veteran brigade, and they would fill in behind the green regiments, which makes sense. So Crawford, for starters, kind of seems to be putting them in the wrong place. And when Mansfield delivers the 10th Maine and starts back, he sees that they're sort of fumbling around here a little bit, and he tells Crawford to withdraw that regiment and bring up the veteran regiments, the 46th Pennsylvania and 20th New York. And then he heads off to the 124th Pennsylvania. He gets there, he sees Williams deploying them along a wood line in the North Woods because they don't know how to form a line yet. And he basically says, okay, keep up what you're doing. And the sound of gunfire is picking up over here toward the center and towards the East Woods. He looks over that way sort of nervously and tells Williams to continue what he's doing. And then he heads off this way to pick up the 128th Pennsylvania and bring them down here. About that time, Crawford shows up behind Williams, asks Williams what he's supposed to do. And Williams snapped at him and said, attend to the deployment of your brigade at once. Williams didn't think very much of Crawford either. And let's see here. He basically said that he didn't have any more capability in I guess managing troop movements than the Green Colonels, just a few weeks away from home. And so he told him to do that. And Williams continued deploying the 124th Pennsylvania. So when Mansfield goes over here, he leads the 128th forward past the 125th Pennsylvania, and they start deploying here in this kind of northwest corner of the East Woods. There's a knoll there, and these 2 veteran regiments had already lined up, and so they're trying to move over here to the west, and they get jammed up. The left side of their regiment gets jammed, and it's kind of unraveling this deployment. And part of that is their colonel just got shot in the head up here in the knoll, and their lieutenant colonel was shot as well. So both of them are out of the fight, and the major doesn't know what he's doing. The colonel of the 46th Pennsylvania and a sergeant in the 20th New York try to help them unravel this. The colonel, Joseph Knipe, says he sees it's not going to work out, and he thinks, okay, well, it'd be better off for you to just pitch in attack rather than try to get into line. And so that's what that major does. We'll get back to that in a second. So Mansfield heads over to the 10th Maine, and he sees them firing on these Confederates in the East Woods, and they're leftovers from Hood's division, except for this skirmish battalion from Colquitt's brigade. And I'll just say that's a difference from the traditional interpretation. Most folks think that's the 21st Georgia. I kind of explain why I think it's Colquitt's skirmish battalion in the book, but so they're exchanging fire with these folks, and Mansfield thinks they're Federals, and he tells them to stop firing. And then one of the captains says, "Okay, well, no, sir, it's the Confederates." He looks again, and then he realizes he made a mistake, tells them to continue, and then he gets shot in the chest, and he's mortally wounded. He dies the next day. He's carried back to where they started the morning, and then dies the next morning. So in the meantime, the 128th Pennsylvania does pitch into the cornfield. Roswell Ripley's brigade, minus Ripley himself, comes up here, and they had replaced Hood, and they're chasing some of these Pennsylvania reserves that had been chasing Hood. And at that moment, the rightmost regiment, 3rd North Carolina, whose troops incidentally set this fire here at the Muma House, they get hit more or less in the flank by the 128th Pennsylvania. Fortunately for them, the Pennsylvanians don't exactly know what they're doing, and the North Carolinians pivot and then pitch into the Pennsylvanians, who then draw off. The North Carolinians then go into the woods, or excuse me, into the corn, and they're exchanging a little bit of fire with the Crawford's veteran people. They're quickly replaced, though, by Gordon. Urgent signals were sent to Gordon to move out. They double quick up the hill, drop the knapsacks here at the North Woods, and then they deploy pretty rapidly. And they're up on this kind of high ground, the 3rd Wisconsin especially, and from there they're taking a lot of fire because they're silhouetted with the sky behind them and pretty easily seen. 2nd Massachusetts moves forward, and they take a right angle here in the orchard of the D.R. Miller property, and they put out a lot of really good fire on, we'll see in a minute, with Colquitt's people. So their rightmost regiment is all the way up here at the fence, and they're just getting enfiladed by the 2nd Massachusetts. And the punishment between these two brigades is pretty intense. Colquitt had replaced Ripley's brigade, which is moving off. And so in the meantime, Greene starts to move into position, and Williams, who took over for Mansfield, was meeting with Hooker up in this area south of the North Woods, and John Gibbon and George Gordon Meade come up and looking for reinforcements, and he sends Goodrich's brigade across the pike to help Gibbon. And so Greene's missing that brigade now. And I'll give a couple quick anecdotes about the 6th Georgia. So as they're moving forward, they've got a major. His name's Philemon Tracy, and he had been badly wounded at 7 Pines in the thigh and in the face, and he was convalescing. He left convalescence in Richmond early in order to rejoin his regiment, and he crossed the Potomac River on the night of the 16th to 17th, and then joined them this morning. And as he's crossing the cornfield, he's shot in a femoral artery, and he bleeds out in the cornfield that morning. So, and then actually, I'll get to the rest here in a minute. What happens is Greene swings around through here and deploys in this small cornfield and just to the north and northeast of the East Woods. And his 2 brigades swing through here. They end up clearing out after some actually hand-to-hand fighting in some spots, the East Woods, and the Ohio regiments, they're really small after Cedar Mountain. They end up in the woods here just northeast of the cornfield, and really almost right in front of the 6th Georgia. And Captain John Hanna, the 6th Georgia's rightmost company, he noticed them, and most of the regiment did not. He pointed out to Colonel James Mitchell Newton, and just as he did, a volley from the Ohioans ripped through the 6th Georgia, killing both of them. And Captain William Plain and another person in Plain's Company H were standing right by Newton. They both pick him up and start moving towards the rear. And both of them are shot down really rapidly by a volley. And it's not long before the 28th Pennsylvania, a 15 company regiment that hasn't been in a major engagement yet, swings around, but they're not brand new, so they kind of know what they're doing a little bit. They swing around behind the 6th Georgia, and this degenerates into hand-to-hand fighting in the cornfield. The Gordon's brigade stops firing, and that Greene is sort of leading this brigade at a stiff trot, his hat's off, his sword's in his hand. An Indiana soldier described that scene. But after some sort of quick hand-to-hand fighting, it turns into this running fight, and Colquitt's people will make a volley and then withdraw, and then they'll reform again, do a volley and withdraw. And they do that at several kind of strong points, and Tyndale's people are following them. And I described in the book how I believe part of the 28th Pennsylvania actually split off from the rest of the regiment, but won't get into those details right now. And but this is where I kind of think the path was based on what I've looked at, but that's not 100% certain. In any event, they come under this artillery fire. SD Lee's artillery had been there all morning, and this is their kind of like final engagement, and they have pretty good range on them. There's some good anecdotes about being under that artillery fire. But they eventually drive off Lee's people, and mostly it's the 102nd New York over here, actually right there. They end up splitting off and going on in all kinds of different directions. And Greene ends up eventually having to go and on horseback bring them all in. But they're getting down to the point where they're on the flank of these batteries, and they draw off. And so what ends up happening is they all collect here where the visitor center is today on this Dunkerchurch plateau, and they're out of ammunition mostly by that time. So Gordon's brigade follows, but they're soon told to get out of the way because, and they end up back in the East Woods because the 2nd Corps finally has shown up. McClellan gave orders. The John Sedgwick's division is in the lead, and they show up here in the East Woods and then pitch west. And that's a whole different story, but they're sort of heading in the wrong direction. And so Gordon's people get out of the way for that. And Greene's down here waiting for ammunition. The first of 2 batteries shows up. It's J. Albert Monroe's Rhode Island battery. And he arrives, asks for infantry support. Greene, kind of in a hushed tone, tells him, well, we don't have any ammunition. And Monroe thought that was a strange place to be, a half a mile ahead of the rest of the army without ammunition. But he decided that as long as he had a limber chest with ammunition, he'd stay with him. So take a moment here to give a couple of updates on what the people thought of Greene and Tyndale. So of Greene, actually, I'll say Tyndale first. Who would have believed a month before that the 28th would ever cheer that officer? He, the over-strict yet kind-hearted but misunderstood Tyndale. And I desire to say that in all 24 battles and 19 skirmishes in which the regiment and brigade participated in during the War of the Rebellion, in none was it so well handled as at the Battle of Antietam by Lieutenant Colonel Tyndale. And then another 28th Pennsylvanian wrote soon after the battle, Colonel Tyndale is as brave as steel. All his faults are forgotten. He is brave. And of Greene, somebody wrote that they're no longer so fierce for hitting him with a brick, which I think is kind of great. So Greene's people were basically the Confederate artillery position down here and kind of make the decision for Greene's people about where they're going to stop, because if you've ever been there, it's pretty precipitous on the eastern shoulder of this plateau, and they are basically taking cover from the artillery fire. And like I said, they didn't have any ammunition, and kind of just in the nick of time, the Lafayette McLaws's division shows up here, and they start following what Jubal Early already did. He was the only infantry left in the West Woods. He started pitching into the 125th Pennsylvania of Crawford's brigade, which one of Crawford's staffers told them to just kind of go forward by themselves and take position in the West Woods, which was kind of a tall task for a Green regiment. But they kind of do okay for being brand new. And so they end up getting hit on both flanks ultimately by Barksdale and then by the lead regiment of Kershaw's brigade. And they pushed the 125th Pennsylvania and any of these Second Corps supports that showed up off. And in the meantime, Monroe's battery was replaced by Tompkins' Rhode Island battery, and they do really great service here. But the second South Carolina, they go forward without the rest of their brigade, and they end up here kind of taking position, taking pot shots at these troops and batteries departing. And eventually they break up and different parts of the regiment go after. They think there's a gap over here because all the Federals are behind the ridge. And an Ohio regiment actually puts their color guard and half of one company forward to sort of entice them forward. And part of the regiment goes forward towards them. Part of the regiment dashes off for Tompkins' rightmost battery, who has been preoccupied with counter battery fire and supporting these attacks toward the sunken road. And they didn't notice them coming at first. And they get within about 50 feet of the battery before they get noticed. But the infantry have been resupplied with ammunition, and they start firing on them. Tompkins turns and fires on them, and they kind of make a hasty retreat into the woods. They get back down here, and they see the 7th and 8th South Carolina, their brigade mates, coming towards them. The 3rd had followed Barksdale up here and go to ground because of this battery. But they all recognize each other, and they start cheering, and they start heading back into the fight. So the traditional interpretation here, though, is that the 2nd South Carolina goes basically back exactly where they went the first time. I don't believe that's the case based on the evidence that I've seen. And it looks much more likely that they actually crossed over the Dunker Church or the Hagerstown Pike, past the Dunker Church, and went north of the Smoketown Road, went through the swale and up this little rise. And they actually got pretty close to on the flank of these Ohio regiments who had to change front a little bit to meet them. Meantime, the other 2 South Carolina regiments were driving forward, and the major in the 7th South Carolina, William Capers White, he when his colonel had been wounded right around this eastern part of the woods, he vaulted forward and led the regiment forward. He had already been a spherical case had already exploded and threw him to the ground. He had dirt and blood on his face, and he was leading the regiment forward, trying to get into this right section. And he was hit with canister, so he didn't make it. So let's see. The meantime, John Sedgwick's division had run into a lot of problems with McLaws's division, and they are making their way pretty hastily to the north. Calls for reinforcements had come, and Gordon answered it with the 2nd Massachusetts and the Green 13th New Jersey, whose colonel was Ezra Carman, who was the kind of great historian of Antietam. Anyway, they head forward, and I'm not getting into those details right now, but they get to the road and end up running into a lot of problems, and they end up having to come back to the East Woods. So right behind Kershaw's brigade down here is John G. Manning, Van Manning's brigade of John G. Walker's division. And I had mentioned them down at Snavely's Ford. They got orders to come up to this side of the field too, as Lee is shifting forces around the field. And 3 of his regiments continue forward, and they're pretty close behind Kershaw. 2 of the regiments he leaves behind under Colonel John Clark, and they stay right here. They'll be important in a minute. So part of Manning's division then attacks. What ends up happening here is the 46th North Carolina decide that it looks far too challenging to go forward. And they're kind of, the big thing they're concerned about is the angle of the Smoketown Road that they would have to cross. And then meanwhile, the 30th Virginia goes forward immediately, and they're fighting for a little while. And the 48th North Carolina, its Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Walkup is trying to get the regiment forward. The colonel's not leading them forward, and he eventually threatened some of his men with his revolver. He does cajole the regiment forward. They get out into this open field, but by the time they do, the 30th Virginia is falling back because they had been fighting all by themselves. And now you're left with the 48th North Carolina out here in this field in the center of all this fire, kind of by themselves. And at that moment, Greene he attacks, and they kind of sweep around both flanks. And the 48th North Carolina can't be stopped even by the pleas of Kershaw's people, who had taken position here again inside the West Woods. And so all of them get pushed out. Greene's people go the whole way to the west side of the woods, and then they retrench back to this western slope of this hill west of the Dunker Church. And they are they're out of ammunition again. They get resupplied. And so by the time they're done here, they go through that second resupply, which is 140 rounds total by the time they're done with the day. And people are using rocks and trees trying to push the ramrods down. And, it's so common to hear about, we're picking up ammunition off the dead and the wounded. But these people are actually replacing the rifles with the dead and the wounded because the rifles are so badly fouled that they couldn't use them anymore. And so there's skirmishing that's going on here to the west and to the south with Cook's people and with some of these Van Manning people. And the other brigade of Walkers had moved into line here in the woods, and they are real close, and neither side knows they're there. There are a few individuals in the 13th New Jersey and the Purnell Legion that these two show up as reinforcements, and they are kind of scouting out here. There's people that are really watching because they think they know what's going on out here. Greene, however, had no idea that Sedgwick had been driven out of the West Woods, and so he thinks that they're Federals up here. And Carman sends to Greene. Eventually, Greene rides down the hill, and he looks and he says, "Nope, they're still Federals up there." And he gets back to his little, I guess you call it a command post near the Dunker Church, and a corps staffer shows up, and Greene makes sort of a flip comment. "Do you believe my regimental commander down there? They think they're the Confederates in the woods up there." And the staffer says, "What? Didn't you realize that?" And a bunch of expletives explode out of Greene's mouth, and he realizes the situation he's now in. And he's already been sending for reinforcements, but he actually heads back for reinforcements himself now. And while he's there, they're not sending him reinforcements, by the way. They're shifting units around to defend batteries and defend, the flank of a regiment that just showed up from the 6th Corps, that kind of thing. And these folks are 3/4 of a mile ahead of the army, possessing the ground that was the objective all day, and literally out of sight because you can't see from here to there if you're on the field today. And while he's back there, kind of by accident, both flanks get assaulted. A gun gets taken, and basically the whole group heads back towards the Muma house, which is over here and had been on fire. They try to rally everybody on the Dunker Church Plateau. That doesn't really, they're not having it. And the only regiment that really does sort of a fighting retreat is the 28th Pennsylvania. And they're working their way back, and they're getting rallied again by these haystacks, by the Muma house, by Tyndale, and a ball goes through the back of his head. And two of the members of the 28th Pennsylvania, people who that morning would have no reason to do this at all, actually run forward 50 yards and collect what they think is his dead body and bring it back. And I don't know of many instances in the Civil War where folks are doing that sort of thing. But they do that for this brigade commander who the whole regiment basically hated. One of those guys had been on that 28th Pennsylvania detachment behind enemy lines, and the other one was a lieutenant who was carrying a flag from the 7th South Carolina. Tyndale's brigade took 9 colors that morning. So they had a pretty good day, successful day. And that's pretty much the end of it for the 12th Corps. They everybody sort of withdraws back towards the Sam Poffenberger house, and kind of get themselves ready to fight again, but they are not engaged anymore. So I went a little long. Thank you very much. I apologize for that. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, like I said, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and then and ask Chris any questions.
Yeah, Chris, Joe Boslett. I was curious, who was coordinating the Union Army activities on the morning of the 17th? It seems like there was a lot of disjointed commanders. Nobody was coordinating anything. Somebody would hit the Confederate line and then they'd back off, and then another group would hit them. I mean, I've read where coordinated attacks probably would have carried that morning, but everything seemed just so disjointed. And what was McClellan doing sitting on the other side of the Antietam Creek? Did he see anything that was going on?
Yeah, I mean, he could see some of this. He probably would have been better served to be on the western side of the creek, in my opinion. And he did come over at one point.
He didn't go over.
But it was really kind of a Joe Hooker show over there. And Hooker was doing a really good job. Now, he didn't have the 12th Corps available immediately because they bivouacked so far away. Okay. They probably should have been over earlier in the evening on the 16th. And he could have had them available sooner. And I think that would have done him a lot of good. And then, of course, the 2nd Corps showed up. Bull Sumner wasn't really listening to, anybody about which direction he should be going. And so that was sort of a wasted opportunity too. And by the time, so Hooker got shot in the foot, he basically passed out from loss of blood and was carried off the field. And so from that moment that he and Mansfield were gone, the wind just sort of went out of the sails, right? Okay. Because there was nobody that kind of soldiered up to fleeted up to take their spots, right? Because they were both working fairly effectively. I mean, you can't really say that too well about Mansfield, but Hooker certainly was. And he was pressing his advantage once the 12th Corps broke through. And he was up at the front, he was moving artillery into place, getting units moved, but then he was gone. And it does not appear that Williams did a lot from that point on. Sumner was basically out of the fight. Kind of his somebody said his moral courage was gone. I mean, he still would have charged a hill, they said, but he lacked the perspective to be able to like put soldiers where they needed to be. And he was really just worrying about his own people too. And then Franklin showed up. Franklin wanted to attack. I mean, this is early afternoon. He wanted to attack, but got waved off. And people say a lot about McClellan making the decision to not do it, but it was largely influence from Sumner, who was telling him he shouldn't do it. So it's a great point. There wasn't good coordination, and I get into it about the 12th Corps making it. Green's people making it up there. They never got any kind of support, and it's almost comical the stuff that they're moving units around 3/4 of a mile back where they're not going to be attacked anyway. And so I think it's a good point.
Good job with this. You've really clarified a lot of things from what I had read before, and I'm anxious to get a copy of your book, and one of these days I may get lucky enough to have you sign off on it. So thank you. Good job.
Yeah, I'd love to meet people up there and sign books sometime too. But actually, if anybody wants to get a book, I mean, you can get it from the publisher or Amazon or wherever. But if you end up wanting to get one signed for me, like immediately, just reach out to me. I'll put one in the mail to you. Any other questions?
Yeah, Chris, Don Madar. Hey, it was great meeting you down at the Antietam Institute. And to just reiterate what Joe said, you've done such an awesome job on clarifying a lot of the infantry movement. the one thing in your maps, you know, it's sort of, I wanted to bring this up for the group because you and I saw it, is the presence of the artillery position. You look at the cannons that were drug out into the, you know, into the field by the Union side, but on the maps, you don't really see the artillery that was up on the ridge
Oh, up
at Nicodemus and the whole way down, right? So
yeah,
that just had to be a hellfire in the midst.
yeah. Well, and they were they're driven off and kind of in the morning, but sorry, I'm kind of flailing around here. Of course, that we was talking about, so they would have been up in here in the early morning. But anyways, yeah, that is definitely a really good artillery position there, and put a lot of fire down the First Corps in the morning.
And Don, the picture you said, who was that of in the chat?
Yeah, I just happened because I noticed in the presentation that Steinrook didn't have a photo. So I sort of went out there. I said, you know, I've never seen him myself. So I just took a shot of going to find a grave, and there he was. So I figured I'd throw it out there for the group.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen a picture of him before, but I never was able to track one down that was like, you know, that I could put in the book and like the right kind of resolution, that sort of thing. And then, of course, you're talking about going to Chancellorsville. He is killed at Chancellorsville.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, Chris, can you give me the screen back? I'm not sure how to do that myself. I just have one little quick thing. So
Yeah.
yeah. Oh. Somewhere I got to get my stupid thing going. Hang on, folks. Okay, yes, just a notification for next month. There has been a change. We're going to have a speaker, Derek Maxfield. He's going to be talking about Helmira, about the prison camp. So if anybody is, we'll be here February the 16th at the same time. So again, Chris, I want to thank you for all that you did. And like I said, it was an outstanding presentation, and we really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for coming aboard and giving us a good talk.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being here. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, anybody else any other questions before we close out? Okay, if not, good night, everybody, and we'll see you February the 16th. And I'm going to try to make tomorrow night's Harrisburg Roundtable meeting non-Zoom. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks again, Chris.